Martin Cook, otherwise known as the blood pump guy. Welcome to the MedTech Unboxed podcast.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great to be here. And thanks for referring to me as the blood pump guy.
Yeah. I only say that because you mentioned it, so I wouldn't call you that otherwise. It's good to be. I was on talking to a guy that's an expert in nitric oxide for health reasons, and he's known as the nitric oxide guy. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, Martin, to learn about Ventra Medical and the percutaneous heart pump market. It's a growing market. There's certainly a need, but I know there's some challenges, gaps, unmet needs there that you can address. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. But let's go through the history, your background, Ventra Medical, and a little bit about the history of PVAD as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. My history, you referred to me as the blood pump guy. If we go way back to my academic background, it's a PhD in fluid mechanics, and that's what got me into all sorts of blood pumps, left ventricular assist devices, artificial hearts, that sort of thing. But Ventra Medical actually came out of an acquisition, an exit that my current co-founder, Dr. Suku Thumbar, and I had. We had a percutaneous mitral valve company. And in 2017, that was acquired by Edwards Life Sciences, which was fantastic. So following that, we put our heads together for the next big thing in MedTech. And we identified PVADs. And I'm a blood pump guy, as you mentioned. And my co-founder is an interventional cardiologist. So it was a good match to go into the PVAD space. And, obviously we'd been watching the success of Abiomed, and all credit to them for opening up the PVAD catheter-based blood pump market. And so we formed Ventra Medical back in 2018, but it really took off when we identified a patent portfolio that was collecting dust, and we got an exclusive license to that. So that was really the foundations of the company. And I can tell you, back in those days, sort of pre-pandemic, there was a lot of skepticism around PVADs. Would they really work? Was it something that was going to be sustained? But as I'm sure we'll talk about later, there's now clinical evidence for PVADs, specifically in cardiogenic shock patients.
Mm-hmm.
So those skepticism is now behind us. And as you mentioned, the PVAD market is massive and growing, and it's a really exciting story. And I'm proud to have a team putting together the best PVAD out there.
Great. We talk about the market. What is can you give us just a highlight of the market for PVAD?
Yeah, sure. There's actually multiple markets, if you like, because there's multiple indications for PVADs. Currently, J&J, who now own Abiomed, have reported just under $2 billion in annual revenues. And that's growing at 18%. So it's not often you have such a big market that's also growing at double-digit figures. So it's a hugely exciting market. And I mentioned that there's multiple indications. The indication that we focus on, but not exclusively, is cardiogenic shock. And for those who don't know, this is a condition where there's just a critically low cardiac output, often following a heart attack, but can be heart failure and other causes. And it's an emergency situation. You've got minutes to hours to provide the patient with not only prompt support, but a high level of cardiac support. And that's, in the US alone, there's 100,000 cardiogenic shock patients. And then there's also the high-risk PCI market. So this is high-risk patients who need to have a stent or other coronary intervention that need cardiac support, or else the procedure can't go ahead. And then there's also uses for this device as a bridge to transplant, or bridge to other therapy like an LVAD. And what's really exciting coming along is the STEMI market. So STEMI is a type of heart attack, a particularly bad type of heart attack. And there's early clinical evidence or early clinical and early preclinical evidence that shows that, rather than the current standard of care, which is to rush the patient to a cath lab and put in a stent and unblock the coronary blockage, if you rush them to a cath lab and put in a PVAD and offload the ventricle and get the oxygen demand of the myocardium down, then you can actually reduce the infarct size that the patient has, or keep it small. with the obvious results of that of hopefully better mortality and hopefully better chances of avoiding heart failure subsequently to that. And that's a huge market. That's not approved at the moment. We're expecting a big trial called the Door to Unloading study to come out, the results to come out next year. If that's positive, that could and would double the market for PVADs. So you've got a $2 billion market growing at 18%, potentially doubling coming along. We've had some cardiologists invest in our company, and one of them said to me recently, the sky's the limit for PVADs. So the market is extraordinarily exciting. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, that's Highcroft you're mentioning?
Yeah, Highcroft is a VC firm here in Minneapolis, really made up of physicians and largely cardiologists, and it's been a great endorsement to have them invest in Ventra Medical.
Yeah, excellent. We'll get into that a little bit later, I guess, when we get into funding. But thanks for the kind of the overview of the market. Very exciting. And we know, as exciting as it is, there's challenges or unmet needs with the predicate devices out there related to profile, flow, right, ambulation. And if you can kind of walk us through that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I would say, and reiterate, I said before, Abiomed, who are the monopoly player in this space, have done a fantastic job with technology which really came out of the 1990s, developed in Germany. And really what it boils down to for the physician is they've got, really for left heart failure, two choices. They can put in what's called the Impeller CP device. And it's a relatively low profile, 14 French device, can be put in through the femoral artery in a cath lab. But as a result of being small, low profile, the level of cardiac support that it can provide is relatively limited. And that means, I think, in a lot of cases, the device has to be pushed to its limits in terms of, the speed of rotation of the little spinning impeller, which can lead to things like hemolysis issues. And 14 French, while it's, certainly a size you can do through the femoral access, it has significant complications related to bleeding and limb ischemia. So, for instance, in the landmark study that was released last year, the Danger Shock study, there was about 20-odd% serious adverse events through bleeding and limb ischemia. So they're not without their complications. The alternative for the cardiologist when they get a cardiogenic shock patient is to put in the much larger device, the Impeller 5.5, but it requires a surgical cut down, needs an OR to be prepped, not something that can be done on an emergency basis. So the fundamental problem in the catheter blood pump space is this conundrum between size and the level of cardiac support. And that's what you're really balancing. We speak to cardiologists and they say, look, we'd much rather put in an Impeller 5.5, but I can't wait 3 hours for the surgical team to be prepped and the OR to be readied. So I put in the smaller device and hopefully can bridge them to putting in another therapy afterwards with a higher level of cardiac support, be it ECMO or maybe upgrade to an Impeller 5.5, which happens as well. So, great technology. It's a huge market, deserves to be a huge market, but you can imagine that there's room for improvement.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that. What are some of the improvements or the tech platform that you can share to overcome some of these, gaps in the predicate devices?
Yeah, right. And from day one, my co-founder and I wanted to develop a full support device with an eye on cardiogenic shock in particular. So there's two areas where there's huge improvements coming. That's on the French size, the profile of the device, but also on the level of cardiac support. Let me start with the level of cardiac support because that's where Ventra Medical is really differentiated. As I said, a lot of cardiologists tell us they'd much rather put in a full support device, but they can't wait because it needs an OR to be set up. So at Ventra Medical, we've developed a device which, to be honest, is quite incredible. We can pump not only high flows, but the all-important thing is that we can generate high pressures. Let me explain why that's important for a moment. You're sitting there, your heart's pumping between 5 and 6 liters per minute, but it's also generating about 90 millimeters of mercury. So it's bringing in blood from the atrium and it's generating pressure. And your heart, like any pump, generates pressure, and then it's that high pressure that generates the flow. And you need the high pressure to overcome resistance. You know, you have resistance through your brain and your kidneys and all the other areas of resistance. Any pump can pump high flow if there's no resistance.
Mm-hmm.
What you really want is to be able to generate high flows and high pressures at the same time. And what that allows, Steve, is it allows the native ventricle to relax. And it's all about taking the load off the native ventricle. You know, we can turn the speed of our pump down, still have reasonably high flows, but it's the native ventricle that's making up the difference, and it's still working. That's not what we want. We want to be able to generate high pressures, high flows, fully offload the left ventricle, so the native ventricle, you know, can relax and do nothing. And that's what we do. We do that, and we've tested that in all sorts of animal models. In particular, we work with the Mayo Clinic. We just recently published an article in the ASIO journal, and we induce cardiogenic shock in these animals, and then we put in our device. And it's quite incredible to see these animals that have had an infarct, and they've gone into cardiogenic shock, and their cardiac output halves. And then we come in and put in our device. The cardiac output gets back up to what it was pre-infarct. But not only that, we can monitor the effort and the work of the native ventricle, and it goes down to almost nothing. And the left ventricular pressures are really reduced. So the take-home message there is full cardiac support, not just high flow, but true cardiac support. And we do all that through a 9 French system. So no catheter or sheath is larger than 9 French. And that's the real tricky bit, is how do you get a spinning rotor and all the other elements to collapse into a sheath? And really what you want to do is not only collapse them, so you have all these things that are foldable and you know, collapsible, but when they expand, they maintain their shape. When it comes to pumps, it's all about the blades and their blade angles, and you don't want those to change as pressures and flows get high. So we have a unique solution that's based on a nitinol with a covering on the nitinol, which is the basis of our IP. And it's quite incredible that these blades will fold and collapse, but when they expand, they're actually relatively rigid, and they don't deform and deflect and lose their performance as the flows and pressures get high. And that's really the secret to our being able to provide such cardiac unloading. But by getting the French size down, which, you know, some others in the space can do as well, not only does that offset the complications we talked about before, limb ischemia and bleeding, but it opens up the market just in and of itself of being a smaller French size. The cardiologists and centers that we talk about 30% or more of patients, they don't put a PVAD in because their vasculature doesn't support it. Small stature people, women in particular, are less likely to get PVAD support. When we get down to 9 French or 10 French as an industry, but every French size counts. So we're 9 French, which, you know, is really important to be that low. Just that alone will open up the market, you know, and expand it maybe 30, maybe 50%, but something along those lines. So you're looking at a massive market that's growing with new indications coming along, and with a revolution on top of a revolution with these next generation devices. You know, it's no wonder cardiologists have said, as I mentioned before, the sky's the limit for PVADs.
Yeah, I mean, $2 billion's not even close when you put these other variables in consideration. Right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting that when J&J bought Abiomed, they had about 900 million revenues, I think was the last report from Abiomed. And here we are just a few years later, and they're at least double that.
Yeah. Okay. The good foundation set, Martin.
It is.
Yeah. You talked about profile. Does that and opening up the opportunity for like women, and that also probably assists or helps with getting around or ambulation as well, right?
Yeah, the real key to ambulation is moving from the femoral access up to axillary or even potentially upper limb. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we're certainly looking forward to percutaneous access through the axillary approach. You know, in future years, that's not standard technique, but if people can cast their mind forward a few years, you'll be looking at axillary access. And if we can get the French size down a little bit more, and we believe we can, then we're looking at upper limb, left arm access. And as you mentioned, the importance of that is then the patient can get out of bed. You've got a cardiogenic shock patient, they've had a heart attack, but after the first day or two, you want to get them up and moving around. Hard to do while you've got them in the femoral position.
Yes.
You really need to get that French size down. And these next generation devices, and we're the smallest, no one's smaller than us in terms of being 9 French, there's the real potential for that moving forward. So, and that could expand the market even further due to better outcomes that you might expect if you can put it in, through these other approaches and get the patients ambulatory and get a sort of a prehabilitation, as they call it. Which is a great thing to look forward to.
Still, even 9 French too large for radial?
I believe it's too large for radial, but brachial, we're getting close.
Okay.
And we have future plans and hopes and prospects to get the French size down a little bit further as well. But certainly axillary access is 9 French is certainly suitable for that.
Okay. When you talk about a collapsible motor and pelvis, nitinol is just a magical material. That's an enabler for that, right?
It is.
To be able to collapse that down into a sheath and then release it because of the shape memory capabilities of nitinol. And you said it maintains its shape, and it's actually it sounds like it's not super elastic, this nitinol. It has some rigidity to it.
Well, it's interesting. It is. We are exploiting the super elastic capabilities, which means that it can fold and bend without plastically deforming. But because of the way we've designed it, and I've got a really fantastic team, not only our internal team, but we work with a group called Resolution Medical here in the Twin Cities, and they're just brilliant at this sort of thing.
Yes.
I'd have to go into the details of how it's designed, but we've come up with a way that we can fold and collapse, and then it'd be rigid when it expands. The alternative way to do it, which some others do, is have these blades purely polymer. And, we explored that in the early days, but polymers aren't going to be as rigid as something with a metal support. And they end up having to be, certainly our assessment of it was the blades would have to be quite thick and have more than 2 blades. And these sorts of things reduce the performance. So we moved to a nitinol supported blade strategy, if you like, and it's worked extremely well for us. And we've had engineers join from other PVAD projects, sort of first generation devices, and I can tell you, Steve, their eyes pop out of their head when they see a device that comes out of a 9 French sheath and then starts pumping like an LVAD is incredible. And not, one of the other limitations is, all engineering has competing requirements. That the other competing requirement is hemolysis or blood damage. And, I've been battling that issue, developing blood pumps for 25 years, but we've done acute animals, cardiogenic shock animals, chronic animals. We track the blood damage, the hemolysis, and we've done benchtop testing as well, and compared against other existing predicate devices, and our hemolysis is lower, which is fantastic. And I think it all comes from a fundamentally sound design approach of how we design the pump and the blades, which we've talked about. It opens up the world to much better hemodynamic or hydraulic performance. It means we can keep the rate of rotation of our device down, which limits the blood damage. And overall, we get a device that's meeting all our expectations.
Okay. That's excellent. And it's interesting what you said a minute about you kind of looked at the polymer-based blades, but, much like the replacement of a metallic stent with a polymer-based stent, like a bioreabsorbable, it just doesn't have the mechanical properties. So you have to thicken it up, and you kind of lose profile and such, and the benefits. So I can
good
relate
comparison.
To that. Yeah. If you wouldn't mind going through you have an animation you can kind of share. Would this be a good time to share that, Martin?
Sure. Let's do that. I'll just share that, and we'll get that going. So imagine you've had a patient who has had a massive heart attack, let's say, and they've been rushed to the cath lab, and an interventional cardiologist like my co-founder, would implant a device like this. Our pump is actually collapsed inside that 9 French blue delivery sheath. It's advanced over a super stiff wire into the LV. And in a second, you'll see that blue sheath retracted. And the device naturally expands, including the all-important little rotor that you see there spinning. And from now on, it's the same mechanism of action as existing PVADs. It draws blood from the damaged and injured left ventricle, pumps it into the aorta, and it takes over the function of the aorta, of the left ventricle. And then after a few hours to a few days, we retract it, and as you just saw, recollapse it into the 9 French sheath and back out of the tiny wound in the patient's groin.
Wow. You talked about the time frame, a couple of days. The durability, is that all a big factor in the design input?
Well, it certainly is. For high-risk PCI patients, you're looking at a few hours during the procedure, so that's less of an issue. STEMI patients, certainly if that indication is approved, you'd be looking at maybe 6 to 8 hours of use. It's in cardiogenic shock where we go into multi-day use. The current Impeller CP has a 4-day approval, and that's what we'd be looking to get.
Okay.
We've done chronic animals out to just under 4 days, and that was really to prove not only reliability of the device, but also hemolysis over that time.
Okay.
And on the bench, we've run out to 20 days. We run them frequently to about 7 days. And the concern historically has been the fact that the device is driven by a drive cable. So the little motor that runs the pump is outside the body, and there's a drive cable. And the very first PVAD that ever existed was called the hemo pump that you may have heard of back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it had some issues with the cable fracturing inside the body. That was 30 years ago, and over 30 years, materials and drive cables have just improved enormously, and we just don't see that anymore. We did have some issues with animals where the animals would bash against the side of their stall and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But no, the drive cables these days are more than capable of going many, many days. So it's something that we are constantly assessing because reliability and durability is important, but there's no reason why 4 days is not entirely achievable, if not much longer.
Okay. Good point about the materials. A lot has come a long way with materials and these wires, these torque wires that can withstand, tiny miniature wires that can withstand, tensile strength and torque. The Fort Wayne Metals is really good at that. So yeah, good. Thanks
Indeed.
for pointing that out. Yeah. Let's move on to kind of clinical. You did talk a little bit about some studies that were done, and if you can kind of share some of that.
Yeah, sure. So
results.
Last year there was a Abiomed study in cardiogenic shock. It was a landmark study called the Danger Shock Trial. It was really an important event in the PVAD world. It showed a decrease in mortality for cardiogenic shock patients, and notwithstanding some complications, but a very positive study, and top level evidence that PVADs are suitable for improving survivability in cardiogenic shock patients. And in fact, that was the first device in decades that have shown any improvement in mortality for cardiogenic shock patients. So a really important study. That's led to reimbursement around the world for cardiogenic shock patients getting PVADs. In my home country of Australia, following that study, reimbursement was improved for cardiogenic shock patients. And then the other study that's coming out, hopefully next year, is the STEMI door-to-unloading study. And this is where the patients are rushed to a cath lab, and rather than door-to-balloon, it's door-to-unloading, and they rush them into the cath lab and get a PVAD in and leave the PVAD in for a while before they unblock the coronary artery, which is a paradigm shift for cardiologists, as you can imagine. But early clinical data and early preclinical data showed that there's a better outcome if you unload the left ventricle and take off the oxygen consumption and maybe reduce or eliminate the reperfusion injury that you get when you implant a stent. So yet to be seen, but we hope that that's going to be positive next year, and that will be another landmark study in the PVAD space.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about Highcroft, and they're kind of led by physicians, and I guess that's one of the modalities that you could raise money to keep developing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're looking to close out what we call our Series B.
Okay.
We've raised 2 rounds to date. We're looking to get into our first in human next year, which you can imagine is a big milestone for us. And it is, and I have to thank the people and the doctors at Highcroft Capital. They're, as I said, a Minneapolis-based VC group. I think there's about 50 doctors in the group. And, you know, you can imagine that's a real endorsement for a technology to have users of PVADs learn about our product and our company and want to invest in it because they can see that, you know, the future is devices like Ventra. So that's fantastic to have them on board on our cap table, and we're looking forward to getting into our first in human next year.
Excellent. You talked about the future. I mean, and you did talk a little bit about all the growth opportunities. You know, where do you see this space in 5 to 10 years?
Wow. Look, even if it just kept growing at its current rate, it would be a massive market. If the STEMI proves possible, and we think it will, you know, that growth is going to accelerate. And then that's with the existing sort of first generation technologies. As these next generation technologies come on board with the French sizes reduced, we're going to see additional adoption. We're going to see more women getting PVAD therapy. We're going to see people with peripheral artery disease being able to get these smaller French sizes. We're going to see, you know, more axillary implants. Certainly with our device, with full unloading, we think we can dramatically improve outcomes for cardiogenic shock patients who need that full level of cardiac support. And then, you know, there's additional uses for the device, like I said, as bridge to transplant and those sorts of things. But, you know, there is a very good future for PVADs out there, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. I think likewise a good future for Ventra Medical. It sounds like.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Martin, this has been a great conversation. Very interesting, very exciting, the technology platform and the growth potential. So I think I'm going to be keeping track of this.
Fantastic. Yeah, it is really exciting. It's great to have such a good story to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A compelling story.
We think so.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
All
Thanks.
Right.